The dark story of Jeffrey Epstein's island, the mansions that held America's secrets 2 miles off the coast of St. Thomas in the crystal blue waters of the Caribbean Sea, sits a 70-acre private island that became synonymous with some of the darkest crimes in modern American history. For more than 2 decades, this tropical paradise served as the personal playground of one of the most notorious criminals of our time. A place where unimaginable horrors occurred behind walls of luxury and privilege, protected by the isolation of the sea and the silence of the powerful. The island was called Little St. James, but to the locals who watched helicopters and private jets ferry young girls to its shores, it had another name, Pedophile Island. And to its owner, the convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein, it was simply Little St. Jeff's, a private kingdom where he believed he was above the law, untouchable, and free to indulge his darkest desires. This is the story of that island and the mansions that held America's secrets. It is a story of wealth and power, of corruption and complicity, of victims who are silenced and a system that failed them. It is the story of how one man built a paradise of horrors in plain sight, surrounded by the most beautiful waters in the world, while the powerful looked away. If this story matters to you, take a moment to subscribe and support the channel. Your support means everything, and I want to hear from you in the comments. What do you think should happen to Epstein's island now? Should it be preserved as evidence, demolished, or transformed into something new? Leave your thoughts below. Chapter 1. The Purchase. In April 1998, a company called LSJ LLC purchased a small private island in the United States Virgin Islands for $7.95 million. The seller was Arch Cummin, a venture capitalist who had listed the property for $10.5 million the previous year. The buyer, according to documents that would later be examined by investigators, was a single individual, Jeffrey Epstein. At the time of the purchase, Epstein was a 45-year-old financier who had amassed a fortune through mysterious means that remain unclear to this day. He claimed to manage money exclusively for billionaires, requiring a minimum investment of $1 billion. Yet few could name his actual clients, and the source of his wealth remained shrouded in secrecy. Financial experts who examined his operations could never fully explain how he generated his income, leading to endless speculation about hidden sources of revenue. Epstein's background was itself unusual. Born in Brooklyn in 1953, he had worked as a math teacher at the prestigious Dalton School in Manhattan before being hired by the investment bank Bear Stearns in 1976. At Bear Stearns, he rose quickly through the ranks, eventually becoming a limited partner. But he left the firm in 1981 under circumstances that have never been fully explained. After leaving Bear Stearns, Epstein founded his own financial consulting firm, J. Epstein & Company. He cultivated an air of mystery around his business, refusing to discuss his clients or his methods. He claimed to help wealthy individuals recover money lost to fraud, but the details of his work remained opaque. By the 1990s, he had somehow accumulated enough wealth to purchase properties worth tens of millions of dollars. What was known was that Epstein moved in the most elite circles of American society. He counted among his associates some of the most powerful people in the world: politicians, scientists, celebrities, and business titans. He had a gift for cultivating relationships with the wealthy and influential, and his social calendar read like a who's who of global power. The island he purchased was small by Caribbean standards, approximately 70 to 78 acres, depending on the measurement, but it was perfectly positioned for his purposes. Located southeast of the larger island of St. Thomas, Little St. James was close enough to civilization to be easily accessible, but remote enough to ensure complete privacy. There were no other residents on the island, no neighbors to observe what happened behind its gates. no authorities who could easily intervene. When Epstein took possession of the island, it had a relatively modest infrastructure. A main house, 3 guest cottages, a caretaker's cottage, a private desalination system, a helipad, and a dock. But Epstein had grander plans. Over the next 2 decades, he would transform this small Caribbean island into a sprawling compound that would become the epicenter of his criminal enterprise. Chapter 2. Building the Compound. The transformation of Little St. James began almost immediately after Epstein took ownership. He hired Edward Tuttle, a renowned architect best known for designing the exclusive Aman resorts, to renovate the main house on the island. The choice of architect was telling. Tuttle's work was associated with the ultra-wealthy, with properties that combined luxury with privacy in some of the most exclusive locations in the world. The renovation of the main house concluded sometime after March 2003. The result was a colonnaded villa-style residence that served as the primary guest accommodation on the island. The architecture was Mediterranean in style, with white walls, terracotta roofs, and expansive terraces overlooking the Caribbean Sea. Multiple bedrooms, each with its own bathroom, ensured that Epstein could host numerous guests simultaneously. But the main house was only the beginning. Over the years, Epstein added building after building to his island compound. 4 smaller single-story guest houses were constructed near the main residence, all with distinctive blue roofs that became a visual signature of the property. A large swimming pool was built adjacent to these structures, creating a resort-like atmosphere. In 2005, Epstein took a significant step to modernize the island's infrastructure. He hired the Virgin Islands Water and Power Authority to install a combination power and fiber optic cable between St. Thomas and Little St. James. This dedicated connection provided the island with reliable electricity and high-speed data connections, eliminating the need for generators and ensuring that Epstein could maintain constant communication with the outside world while remaining isolated from prying eyes. By 2007, Epstein was seeking to dramatically expand his residence on the island. Permit records viewed by investigators revealed plans for a massive renovation that would triple the size of his private quarters. The expansion was to include a 2,400-square-foot wood sun deck with coral stone paving in his organic vegetable garden, a stone patio and sitting area perched at the top of the island for observing sunsets and overlooking the sea, a 10,400-square-foot pool pavilion, a 1,320-square-foot ATV garage made of stone, and a tennis court. The timing of these expansion plans was significant. In 2007, Epstein was in negotiations with federal prosecutors in Florida over allegations that he had sexually abused dozens of underage girls at his Palm Beach mansion. While his lawyers worked to secure a lenient deal that would allow him to avoid serious federal charges, Epstein was simultaneously planning to triple the size of his Caribbean hideaway. By 2008, the estate on Little St. James had grown to require a staff of 70 people to maintain and operate. These employees were bound by strict confidentiality agreements, required to sign documents promising discretion about everything they witnessed on the island. According to former staffers, Epstein was obsessive about secrecy, demanding that his employees remain invisible to guests and never discuss what happened on the property. Chapter 3. The Temple. Of all the structures on Little St. James, none has generated more speculation and controversy than the mysterious blue-striped building that sits on a lookout point at the southwestern edge of the island. The structure, often referred to as the Temple, became a focal point of conspiracy theories and public fascination after aerial photographs revealed its unusual design. The building is shaped like a giant box, painted with distinctive blue and white stripes that make it visible from the water. It is surrounded by an expansive terrace painted bright white with red geometric shapes meant to resemble mosaics. For years, the structure was topped by a golden dome, which Google Earth satellite imagery suggests was added between July 2013 and March 2014. Aerial footage from March 2015 shows the dome and two large golden avian-like statues atop the building, along with two sculptures out front. Locals say the dome was blown away during Hurricane Maria in 2017. According to permit records obtained by investigators, the building was supposed to be a music pavilion. The plans submitted to the Department of Planning and Natural Resources in 2010 showed an octagonal 3,500 square foot structure designed to house a grand piano. Epstein was known to be a talented pianist, and friends and former colleagues described his love of classical music. But the actual structure bears little resemblance to the approved plans. Instead of an octagonal music room, what was built was a rectangular box with blue and white stripes and what appeared to be a false wooden door painted on the front. The discrepancy between the submitted plans and the actual construction raised concerns within the Virgin Islands government. In March 2011, Jean-Pierre Auriol, the then director of the Coastal Zone Management Program, wrote a letter to Epstein's attorney expressing concern that major development is occurring on Little St. James Island through the processing of a series of minor permit applications. Auriol demanded a detailed inventory of all existing structures on the island and a status report on all permits issued to Epstein's company. What actually happened inside the blue-striped building remains a subject of debate. A piano tuner named Patrick Barron, who visited the island in 2012 to service instruments at the property, later provided a description of the interior. According to Barron, the building contained one large room on two levels, a ground floor approximately 4 to 6 feet tall and another on a slightly raised platform accessed by a single step. The flooring appeared wooden and was covered with a large oriental rug. He recalled a gray sofa against one wall, a dark wood desk approximately 10 feet long directly ahead, with floor-to-ceiling bookcases behind it, and a small black grand piano against the opposite wall. But photographs released by the Department of Justice in 2025 told a different story. The images showed the temple in a semi-dismantled state, with an elaborate ceiling mural depicting signs of the zodiac, cloudy skies, and mythical creatures. Two ratty mattresses were visible on the floor. The images raised disturbing questions about how the building had actually been used. Chapter 4. The Private Island Paradise. By the mid-2000s, Little St. James had been transformed into one of the most exclusive private estates in the Caribbean. The compound included multiple residences, swimming pools, a helipad, a cinema, a bathhouse, a library, and even a lagoon that housed flamingos. The island had its own gas station, 3 private beaches, and a dock large enough to accommodate luxury yachts. The attention to detail was extraordinary. Life-size statues dotted the property, including a giant Frisian cow and 2 enormous depictions of cockatiels. Palm trees lined manicured pathways. The grounds were maintained to resort standards, with lush tropical vegetation providing shade and privacy. Epstein visited the property 2 to 3 times per month during the early and mid-2000s, according to reports. When he was in residence, he often hosted powerful people, business executives, politicians, scientists, and celebrities. The guest lists for these visits would later become the subject of intense public scrutiny. The isolation of the island served Epstein's purposes perfectly. Little St. James sits nearly 2 miles from St. Thomas, far enough that a person could not safely swim to shore. There was no way to leave the island without Epstein's assistance, no commercial transportation, no public roads, no escape route. For the young girls who were brought to the island, this isolation was a form of imprisonment. Air traffic controllers and airport personnel at the St. Thomas Airport later reported seeing Epstein with girls who appeared to be preteen, according to complaints filed by Virgin Islands authorities. The sightings occurred repeatedly over years, yet no one intervened. When asked about it later, former Virgin Islands Attorney General Denise George explained the difficulty of investigating crimes on a private island. "Remember, he owns a whole island," George said. "So it wasn't a situation where a child or a young woman would be able to just break away and run down the street to the nearest police station." At least one victim tried. According to a lawsuit filed by Virgin Islands authorities, a 15-year-old girl attempted to escape Little St. James by swimming. The dangerous waters and the distance made such attempts nearly suicidal, which was precisely why Epstein had chosen the location. Chapter 5. The Lolita Express. The island was connected to Epstein's other properties through a sophisticated transportation network centered on his private aircraft. His primary plane, a Boeing 727, became known as the Lolita Express for its alleged role in transporting underage girls to Little St. James and other Epstein properties. Epstein also owned a helicopter that he used to travel the short distance between the private airfield on St. Thomas and his island, a trip of approximately 10 minutes. This allowed him and his guests to arrive on Little St. James without passing through any public areas where they might be observed or questioned. Flight logs from Epstein's planes, which would later become crucial evidence in investigations, documented thousands of trips over the years. The logs included the names of passengers, creating a record of who had traveled with Epstein and where they had gone. These documents would become some of the most sought-after evidence in the investigation into Epstein's crimes. The transportation network also included a boat named Lady Ghislaine, named after Ghislaine Maxwell, the British socialite who would later be convicted of helping Epstein traffic young girls. The boat was used to ferry people between St. Thomas and Little St. James, as well as to other destinations in the Caribbean. For the young victims, the journey to Little St. James often began far from the Caribbean. They were recruited in Florida, New York, New Mexico, and abroad. They were promised jobs, education opportunities, or simply money. They were flown on private jets, treated to luxury experiences, and gradually drawn into Epstein's world. By the time they arrived on the island, many felt they had no choice but to comply with whatever was demanded of them. Chapter 6. The Victims. The crimes that occurred on Little St. James were devastating in their scope and cruelty. Dozens, possibly hundreds, of young girls and women were brought to the island over the years. Many were minors when the abuse began. They came from vulnerable backgrounds, recruited by Epstein and his associates with promises of money, modeling careers, or educational opportunities. The recruitment process followed a consistent pattern that investigators would later document. Epstein and his associates targeted girls from troubled backgrounds, often those who had experienced previous trauma or who came from financially struggling families. They approached these girls with offers that seemed too good to refuse. Hundreds of dollars for a simple massage, the promise of educational scholarships, introductions to powerful people who could help their careers. Once recruited, the girls were gradually drawn deeper into Epstein's world. What began as massage sessions became increasingly sexual. Girls who complied were rewarded with money, gifts, and access to luxury experiences. Those who resisted faced pressure, manipulation, and sometimes threats. And those who tried to leave found that Epstein's reach was long and his resources seemingly unlimited. The isolation of Little St. James made it the perfect location for the worst abuses. Girls who were flown to the island had no way to escape. The nearest land was nearly 2 miles away across dangerous waters. There were no other residents to appeal to, no authorities to contact, no way to communicate with the outside world without Epstein's permission. They were, in effect, prisoners in paradise. Virginia Giuffre, who would become one of the most prominent survivors to speak publicly about her experiences, was just 16 years old when she was recruited into Epstein's world. Working at Donald Trump's Mar-a-Lago resort in Florida, she was approached by Ghislaine Maxwell, who noted the book she was reading, asked about her interest in massage, and offered her a potential job working for Epstein. When Giuffre arrived at Epstein's Palm Beach home for what she thought would be a job interview, she found him lying down naked. Maxwell instructed her on how to provide a massage. Giuffre later said that she had disclosed her troubled past to Epstein and Maxwell, telling them about being a runaway who had been sexually and physically abused. "That was the worst thing I could have told them," Giuffre stated, "because now they knew how vulnerable I was." What followed was years of abuse that took Giuffre around the world. She was flown on private jets to Epstein's properties in New York, Florida, New Mexico, and the Caribbean. She alleged that she was forced to have sex with powerful men, including British Prince Andrew, whom she said abused her 3 times, starting when she was 17. She described being passed around like a platter of fruit to Epstein's powerful associates. In a lawsuit, Giuffre stated that while traveling with Epstein, she saw former President Bill Clinton on Little St. James. Clinton has denied ever visiting the island, and a Freedom of Information Act request for Secret Service records produced no evidence that he had been there. Flight logs showed that Clinton flew on Epstein's planes on multiple occasions, but not near the Virgin Islands. Other victims described similar experiences. They spoke of being trapped on the island with no way to leave, of being forced to provide sexual services to Epstein and his guests, of living in constant fear. The isolation of Little St. James made escape nearly impossible and ensured that what happened there remained hidden from the outside world. Chapter 7. Great St. James. In 2016, Epstein expanded his Caribbean holdings by purchasing the neighboring island of Great St. James for more than $20 million. The larger island, approximately 165 acres, sits to the north of Little St. James and was visible from Epstein's original property. According to lawsuits filed by Virgin Islands authorities, the purchase was motivated by a desire to prevent surveillance of his activities. By 2016, Epstein was a registered sex offender following his 2008 conviction in Florida. His reputation was well known, and investigators were beginning to take renewed interest in his activities. By acquiring ownership and control of Great St. James to the exclusion of others, the lawsuit stated, the Epstein enterprise created additional barriers to prevent those held involuntarily on Little St. James from escaping or obtaining help from others. The lawsuit also alleged that the purchase ensured that the island did not become a base from which others could view their activities or visitors. In effect, Epstein was creating a buffer zone around his private island, ensuring that no one could observe what was happening there. At the time of his arrest in 2019, Epstein was in the process of building a new estate on Great St. James. The plans included an amphitheater and what was described as an underwater office and pool. The construction was never completed. Chapter 8. The Sweetheart Deal. The story of how Epstein avoided serious punishment for years despite widespread knowledge of his crimes is one of the most disturbing aspects of this case. It involves prosecutors who looked the other way, politicians who maintained relationships with a known predator, and a system that protected the wealthy and powerful at the expense of their victims. In 2005, police in Palm Beach, Florida, began investigating allegations that Epstein had sexually abused dozens of underage girls at his mansion on El Brillo Way. The investigation uncovered extensive evidence of abuse, including testimony from multiple victims who described similar patterns of recruitment and exploitation. Federal authorities joined the investigation, and by 2007, Epstein faced the possibility of federal charges that could have resulted in decades in prison. But instead of prosecution, Epstein's legal team negotiated what became known as the Sweetheart Deal. Under a non-prosecution agreement with federal prosecutors in Miami, Epstein pleaded guilty to state charges of soliciting prostitution from a minor. He was sentenced to just 18 months in county jail, of which he served 13 months. During his incarceration, he was allowed to leave the jail for up to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, on work release. The agreement also granted immunity to any potential co-conspirators, effectively shutting down the investigation into others who may have been involved in Epstein's crimes. The deal was negotiated in secret, without the knowledge of Epstein's victims, which later led a federal judge to rule that prosecutors had violated the Crime Victims' Rights Act. Alexander Acosta, the U.S. attorney in Miami who approved the agreement, later became Secretary of Labor under President Donald Trump before resigning amid renewed scrutiny of his handling of the Epstein case. After his release from jail in 2009, Epstein returned to his life of wealth and privilege. He continued to travel between his properties, continued to host powerful guests, and according to local witnesses in the Virgin Islands, continued to bring underage girls to his island. Chapter 9. The Properties Empire. Little St. James was just one piece of Epstein's extensive real estate empire. He owned properties around the world, each serving a purpose in his network of exploitation. Understanding this empire is essential to understanding how he operated for so long without consequences. The properties formed a constellation of locations where he could conduct his activities, moving between jurisdictions to avoid detection and prosecution. The crown jewel of his holdings was a 7-story townhouse at 9 East 71st Street on Manhattan's Upper East Side. The property, originally known as the Herbert N. Strauss House after its initial owner, was one of the largest private homes in New York City. At approximately 28,000 square feet with 40 rooms, including 10 bedrooms and 15 bathrooms, it dwarfed most residences in a city known for cramped apartments. The interior of the Manhattan townhouse was as unusual as its owner. Visitors described rooms filled with odd artwork, including a mural depicting Epstein in prison garb behind bars, commissioned after his 2008 conviction. There were reportedly photographs of famous people throughout the house, some of them nude or sexually suggestive. A life-size female mannequin hung from a chandelier. The decor seemed designed to unsettle visitors while simultaneously displaying Epstein's connections and wealth. The townhouse was designed by Horace Trumbauer, a prominent Gilded Age architect who also designed the Elms in Newport. It featured 15-foot-tall oak entry doors, imported French limestone decorated with carvings and sculpture figures, and was located on one of the most prestigious blocks in the city, across the street from the Frick Collection Museum. How Epstein acquired this property remains one of the enduring mysteries of the case. In 1989, the house was owned by Leslie Wexner, the billionaire founder of L Brands, the company behind Victoria's Secret. In 1991, Wexner granted Epstein power of attorney over his personal finances, an extraordinary level of trust. In 1996, records show the property was transferred to a Virgin Islands company controlled by Epstein for approximately $20 million, though some reports suggest he may have received it for nothing. The Manhattan townhouse was the primary location where Epstein abused victims in New York. When FBI agents raided the property in July 2019, they found a locked safe containing piles of cash, dozens of diamonds, and an expired passport listing Saudi Arabia as Epstein's residence. They also discovered hundreds, possibly thousands, of sexually suggestive photographs of young women and girls. In Palm Beach, Florida, Epstein owned a waterfront mansion at 358 El Brillo Way, which he had purchased in 1990 for $2.5 million. The 14,000-square-foot property featured 6 bedrooms, a separate staff house, and a pool house. This was where many of his Florida victims were abused, and where the initial police investigation began in 2005. The Palm Beach house became the focus of the 2005 police investigation that would eventually lead to Epstein's first prosecution. Investigators discovered massage tables throughout the property, evidence of a systematic operation to bring young girls to the house under the guise of providing massages. Victims described being recruited from local schools and malls, offered money to visit the house, and gradually coerced into sexual acts. During the 2005 raid, police found framed nude photographs, sex toys, soap shaped like genitalia, and extensive photographic evidence. They also found a detailed record of payments to young women, documenting a pattern of abuse that extended over years. The evidence was overwhelming, yet Epstein would ultimately serve only 13 months in county jail with generous work release privileges. After his conviction and release, Epstein returned to the Palm Beach house, which remained his primary residence when he was in Florida. According to local observers, his patterns of behavior did not change significantly after his conviction. Young women continued to be seen arriving at the property. The Palm Beach mansion was demolished by its new owner after Epstein's death, erasing the physical structure but not the memories of those who suffered within its walls. The demolition was approved by Palm Beach County officials, who understood that the house had become a symbol of crimes that the community wanted to forget. Epstein also owned an approximately 10,000-acre ranch near Stanley, New Mexico, known as Zorro Ranch. The sprawling property included a main house of between 26,700 and 33,000 square feet, an airplane hangar, and a private landing strip. Epstein reportedly told associates that he wanted to use the ranch to seed the human race with his DNA, impregnating dozens of women to spread his genes, a disturbing plan that never came to fruition. The New Mexico ranch served as another location for abuse, far from the prying eyes of coastal society. Victims were flown there on private aircraft, isolated on the vast property, and subjected to the same patterns of exploitation that characterized Epstein's operation elsewhere. New Mexico authorities later investigated allegations of abuse at the property, though no criminal charges were filed before Epstein's death. The ranch itself was an enormous operation, with Epstein telling Vanity Fair that it makes the townhouse look like a shack. He maintained staff there, operated aircraft from the private airstrip, and used the isolation of the high desert as yet. Another location where he could conduct his activities far from oversight. In Paris, Epstein maintained an 800-square-meter luxury apartment on Avenue Foch, near the Arc de Triomphe. The apartment was one of the most prestigious addresses in France, located on a boulevard known for its wealthy residents and stunning architecture. The apartment was searched by French authorities following his arrest in 2019, and the investigation revealed that Epstein's activities had extended to Europe as well. French investigators found evidence that Epstein had brought young women to the Paris apartment and had connections to European models and modeling agencies. Jean-Luc Brunel, a French modeling agent who was closely associated with Epstein, was later charged in France with rape and sexual assault of minors. Brunel died in his prison cell in February 2022, in what authorities ruled a suicide before he could stand trial. Together, these properties formed a global network that allowed Epstein to evade law enforcement and continue his crimes for decades. By moving between jurisdictions, he complicated investigations and exploited differences in laws and enforcement priorities. Chapter 10. The Fall. For years, it seemed like Jeffrey Epstein would never face justice. Despite his 2008 conviction, despite the civil lawsuits filed by his victims, despite the whispered warnings that circulated in elite circles, he continued to live a life of extraordinary privilege. He attended dinner parties with the wealthy and powerful. He maintained his properties around the world. He continued to fly on private jets and entertain guests at his island compound. The mechanisms that protected him were multiple and overlapping. His wealth allowed him to hire the best lawyers, who could drag out legal proceedings indefinitely and negotiate favorable outcomes. His connections to powerful people created a web of relationships that made others reluctant to move against him. His operation in multiple jurisdictions complicated law enforcement efforts as agencies struggled to coordinate across state and national boundaries. But the Me Too movement changed the landscape. Beginning in 2017, women began speaking publicly about sexual harassment and abuse by powerful men, and institutions that had previously protected predators began facing consequences. Harvey Weinstein, Bill Cosby, and others were finally held accountable for crimes that had been open secrets for years. The culture was shifting, and the protections that had shielded men like Epstein were beginning to crumble. In November 2018, the Miami Herald published Perversion of Justice, an investigative series by reporter Julie K. Brown that exposed the details of Epstein's sweetheart deal and gave voice to his victims. The series was the result of years of investigation, and it detailed how federal prosecutors had violated the rights of Epstein's victims by negotiating a secret agreement without their knowledge. It told the stories of women who had been abused as teenagers and had spent years seeking justice that never came. The series generated enormous public outrage. How could a man who had abused dozens of underage girls serve only 13 months in county jail with work release? How could federal prosecutors grant him immunity and shut down the investigation into his co-conspirators? How could he return to his life of privilege and continue his activities seemingly without consequence? On July 6, 2019, Epstein was arrested at Teterboro Airport in New Jersey as he returned from Paris on his private jet. Federal prosecutors in the Southern District of New York charged him with sex trafficking and conspiracy to commit sex trafficking. The indictment alleged that between 2002 and 2005, Epstein had sexually exploited and abused dozens of minor girls at his Manhattan and Palm Beach residences. This time, there would be no sweetheart deal. U.S. Attorney Jeffrey Berman made clear that the Southern District of New York was not bound by the Miami Agreement and would pursue the case aggressively. Epstein was denied bail, with the judge citing his vast wealth, international connections, and access to private aircraft as evidence that he was a flight risk. In August 2019, FBI agents conducted searches of Little St. James and Epstein's other properties, gathering evidence for what was expected to be a lengthy trial. The searches revealed the extent of his operation, the infrastructure he had built to support his crimes, and the elaborate measures he had taken to ensure secrecy. Chapter 11. The Death. On August 10, 2019, Jeffrey Epstein was found dead in his cell at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan. The official cause of death was suicide by hanging. He was 66 years old. The circumstances of his death immediately sparked controversy and conspiracy theories that continue to this day. Epstein had been housed in the Special Housing Unit, one of the most secure sections of the prison. He had been placed on suicide watch after a previous incident on July 23rd, when he was found on the floor of his cell with injuries to his neck. But just 6 days later, he was removed from suicide watch, a decision that has never been satisfactorily explained. On the night of August 9th, Epstein was supposed to be checked on by guards every 30 minutes. Instead, according to official accounts, the 2 guards assigned to monitor his unit fell asleep and did not check on him for approximately 8 hours. Both guards later pleaded guilty to falsifying prison records, admitting that they had not conducted the required rounds and had lied about it in official logs. The security cameras that should have recorded the area outside Epstein's cell reportedly malfunctioned that night, producing unusable footage. The specific failures have never been fully explained, though officials have attributed them to technical problems rather than deliberate tampering. Epstein's cellmate had been transferred out just hours before his death, leaving him alone in a cell where he should have had a companion. The transfer was described as routine, but it meant that there was no one present to alert guards if Epstein attempted to harm himself. The combination of failures seemed almost impossible by chance, leading many to speculate that Epstein had been murdered to prevent him from testifying against powerful people. His brother, Mark Epstein, publicly stated his belief that Jeffrey had been killed. He hired a private forensic pathologist, Dr. Michael Baden, who conducted an independent autopsy and concluded that the evidence was more consistent with homicidal strangulation than with suicide. The official medical examiner stood by the suicide ruling, and the Department of Justice investigations concluded that Epstein had taken his own life. But the questions have never gone away. Who benefited from Epstein's silence? What secrets did he take to his grave? Why did so many systems fail simultaneously on the night of his death? Whatever the truth about his death, its practical effect was clear. Jeffrey Epstein would never stand trial. He would never be forced to testify under oath about the powerful people who had visited his island, flown on his planes, or participated in his crimes. The secrets he held died with him. Chapter 12. The accomplice. While Epstein escaped justice through death, his primary accomplice did not. Ghislaine Maxwell, the British socialite who had been Epstein's constant companion and alleged co-conspirator, was arrested in July 2020 at a home in Bradford, New Hampshire, where she had been hiding since Epstein's arrest and death. Maxwell was the daughter of Robert Maxwell, a British media tycoon who had died under mysterious circumstances in 1991, drowning after falling from his yacht in the Atlantic Ocean. After her father's death and the subsequent collapse of his business empire amid allegations of fraud, Ghislaine had reinvented herself as a fixture of New York society. She met Epstein in the early 1990s, and by the mid-1990s she had become his constant companion, confidant, and alleged partner in crime. Witnesses described Maxwell as the face of Epstein's operation, the one who made initial contact with potential victims and put them at ease. She was sophisticated, charming, and well-connected, able to move in elite circles and provide cover for Epstein's activities. She was also, according to prosecutors, a full participant in the abuse. Maxwell was charged with multiple counts related to her alleged role in recruiting, grooming, and sexually abusing underage girls as part of Epstein's operation. Prosecutors alleged that she had played a crucial role in identifying vulnerable young women, gaining their trust, and normalizing sexual abuse. She was accused of being present during abuse, of participating in it herself, and of helping to cover it up. The evidence against Maxwell included testimony from multiple victims who described how she had approached them, befriended them, and gradually introduced them to Epstein's world. Virginia Giuffa's account of being recruited by Maxwell at Mar-a-Lago was echoed by others who described similar patterns of manipulation. In December 2021, Maxwell was convicted on 5 of 6 counts, including sex trafficking of a minor. The verdict represented the first criminal accountability for anyone involved in Epstein's operation. In June 2022, she was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. During Maxwell's trial, testimony revealed new details about Little St. James and the role it played in Epstein's crimes. Witnesses described the island as a place where young girls were taken and where escape was essentially impossible. The isolation that Epstein had carefully cultivated was shown to be a deliberate strategy to trap his victims. Chapter 13. The Aftermath. In the years since Epstein's death, efforts have continued to identify all those who participated in his crimes and to provide compensation to his victims. The Epstein estate established a victims' compensation fund that has paid out millions of dollars to survivors. The estate also began liquidating Epstein's properties to fund these payments and settle lawsuits. The Manhattan townhouse sold in March 2021 for approximately $51 million, a significant discount from its original listing price of $88 million. The buyer was Michael Daffey, a former Goldman Sachs executive. The Palm Beach mansion sold for $18.5 million and was subsequently demolished by its new owner. The Virgin Islands properties proved harder to sell. Little St. James and Great St. James were initially listed together for $125 million in March 2022. The asking price was later reduced multiple times before the islands finally sold in May 2023 for just $60 million, less than half the original asking price. The buyer was Stephen Dekoff, a billionaire financier who founded the private equity firm Black Diamond Capital Management. Dekoff announced plans to transform the infamous islands into a world-class destination resort, pledging to respect the local culture and natural beauty while bringing economic benefits to the region. Under a settlement reached with Virgin Islands authorities, half the proceeds from the sale of Little St. James went to the government to establish a trust funding support services and counseling for victims of sexual abuse and human trafficking. The Epstein estate also paid $105 million in cash as part of the settlement, as well as an additional $450,000 after it was discovered that Epstein had destroyed the remains of centuries-old structures during his development of the Zoo Island. Chapter 14. The Documents. The quest for transparency about Epstein's crimes and those who may have been involved has continued long after his death. Court documents from various lawsuits, particularly Virginia Giuffre's defamation case against Ghislaine Maxwell, have been gradually unsealed, revealing new details about Epstein's operation and the powerful people in his orbit. In January 2024, a major batch of documents from the Giuffre-Maxwell case was released, containing depositions, photographs, and the correspondence that shed light on decades of abuse. The documents named numerous individuals who had connections to Epstein, though being named in the documents did not indicate wrongdoing. Many of those named were victims, staff members, or business associates who had provided testimony about Epstein. The documents revealed the extent of Epstein's network and the strategies he used to maintain secrecy. In one email to Maxwell, Epstein suggested offering rewards to anyone who could disprove allegations made by Giuffre, demonstrating his efforts to discredit his accusers, even from beyond the grave. In December 2025, the House Oversight Committee released additional photographs and videos from Little St. James, taken by Virgin Islands authorities in 2020. The images showed bedrooms, bathrooms, a room containing what appeared to be a dentist's chair with masks on the wall, and a telephone with first names written on speed dial buttons. One photograph captured a blackboard with words like power, deception, plots, and political scribbled on it. The release of these images provided the public with its most detailed look yet at the interior of Epstein's island compound. While the images did not contain evidence of specific crimes, they contributed to the broader understanding of how Epstein had constructed his private world. Chapter 15. Virginia Giuffre. Of all the voices that emerged from the Epstein case, none was more prominent than Virginia Giuffre. From her first public statements about her abuse to her death in April 2025, she remained the most visible advocate for Epstein's victims and the most determined pursuer of justice. Giuffre's journey from victim to advocate was marked by extraordinary courage. She filed lawsuits against Epstein, Maxwell, and others she alleged had abused her. She gave interviews to major media outlets, describing her experiences in graphic detail. She testified in courts in the United States and abroad, facing cross-examination and public scrutiny of the most traumatic experiences of her life. In 2015, Giuffre founded Victims Refuse Silence, a non-profit organization dedicated to supporting survivors of sex trafficking. The organization was later relaunched as SOAR, Speak Out, Act, Reclaim. Through these efforts, she worked to help other survivors find their voices and seek justice. Her lawsuit against Prince Andrew, filed in 2021, alleged that the British royal had sexually abused her 3 times when she was a minor. Andrew denied the allegations, but settled the case in 2022, paying an undisclosed sum and issuing a statement saying he regretted his association with Epstein. The settlement was seen as a significant victory for Giuffre and other survivors. On April 25, 2025, Virginia Giuffre died by suicide at her farm in Western Australia. She was 41 years old. Her family announced her death with utterly broken hearts, and her advocates described her as one of the most extraordinary human beings they had ever known. Before her death, Giuffre had written an unflinching memoir, Nobody's Girl, with the hope that it would be published if something happened to her. The book detailed her experiences with Epstein and Maxwell, her abuse by her own father, and her long struggle for justice. It was published posthumously, ensuring that her voice would continue to be heard even after her death. Chapter 16. The Island Today. What remains of Jeffrey Epstein's island paradise today? The compound he built over 2 decades still stands, though much has changed since his death and the subsequent investigations. Satellite imagery from 2023 shows the main compound still visible on the island, along with multiple swimming pools, tennis courts, the helipad, and the guest villas. The blue-striped temple remains at its perch overlooking the sea, though footage captured by an urban explorer in 2023 showed that the building and surrounding area had been painted white, perhaps in an attempt to erase its infamous appearance. The new owner, Stephen Dekoff, has announced plans to develop the islands into a luxury resort. He has hired architects and engineers to begin work on the project, which he hopes will open by 2025 or shortly thereafter. Dekoff has stated that he never met Epstein and had never set foot on the islands until they were marketed for sale. The transformation of Little St. James from crime scene to resort destination raises difficult questions. Can a place so associated with suffering be rehabilitated? Should the buildings that housed such horrors be preserved as evidence and memorial or demolished to make way for something new? Is it possible for tourists to vacation where children were trafficked and abused? For the Virgin Islands government, the sale represented an opportunity to close a dark chapter and generate revenue for victim services. For Dekoff, it represents a business opportunity to transform a distressed situation into a successful enterprise. For survivors and their advocates, the emotions are more complicated. Chapter 17. The Powerful and the Complicit. One of the most troubling aspects of the Epstein case is the extent to which powerful people associated with him despite widespread knowledge of his crimes. The flight logs of his private jets, his personal calendars, and witness testimony reveal a network of connections that reached into the highest levels of business, politics, science, and entertainment. Epstein cultivated relationships with scientists and academics, donating money to research institutions and hosting gatherings where brilliant minds could mingle. He was a donor to Harvard, MIT, and other prestigious universities. Some of these institutions later faced criticism for accepting his money and providing him with credibility. MIT's Media Lab, in particular, faced a scandal when it was revealed that the lab had accepted donations from Epstein even after his 2008 conviction and had attempted to conceal the source of the funds. He maintained relationships with politicians of both parties. Former President Bill Clinton flew on his planes multiple times, though Clinton has denied visiting the island. Epstein's flight logs documented Clinton as a passenger on numerous occasions, traveling to various destinations including Africa and Asia for philanthropic purposes. Clinton has acknowledged the flights, but denied any knowledge of Epstein's crimes. Former President Donald Trump was photographed with Epstein at Mar-a-Lago and called him a terrific guy in a 2002 interview, noting that Epstein liked beautiful women and that some of them are on the younger side. Trump later said he had banned Epstein from his club following a dispute, reportedly related to a real estate deal. Trump has denied ever visiting the island and stated that he rejected invitations to do so. Prince Andrew, the Duke of York and second son of Queen Elizabeth II, maintained a friendship with Epstein that continued even after his 2008 conviction. Andrew was photographed visiting Epstein's Manhattan townhouse in 2010, walking in Central Park with the convicted sex offender. The photograph caused a scandal in Britain, though Andrew continued to deny any wrongdoing. Virginia Giuffre's allegations against Prince Andrew were among the most detailed and damaging. She alleged that she was forced to have sex with Andrew 3 times, starting when she was 17 in London, New York, and on Epstein's Island. A photograph showing Andrew with his arm around Giuffre's waist, taken at Maxwell's London townhouse, became one of the most iconic images of the scandal. Andrew denied the allegations in a disastrous BBC interview in 2019, claiming he had no recollection of meeting Giuffre despite the photograph. He suggested the photo might be fake and offered various explanations for his association with Epstein that many found unconvincing. The interview was widely criticized and led to Andrew stepping back from public duties. In 2022, Andrew settled Giuffre's civil lawsuit against him for an undisclosed sum, issuing a statement saying he regretted his association with Epstein. In October 2025, amid continuing fallout from the scandal, Andrew announced he was giving up all his royal titles, including Duke of York. The release of Epstein's daily schedules in late 2025 revealed that numerous prominent individuals had met with him over the years, including tech entrepreneurs Elon Musk and Peter Thiel, and political figure Steve Bannon. Being named in these documents does not indicate wrongdoing, and many of those listed may have had innocent business or social interactions with Epstein. But the breadth of his connections raises questions about how someone with his known history could continue to move in elite circles. The question of complicity extends beyond those who may have participated in Epstein's crimes to include those who looked the other way. The prosecutors who gave him a sweetheart deal, the guards who failed to monitor him in prison, the institutions that accepted his money, the powerful people who continued to associate with him after his conviction, all played a role in enabling his crimes to continue for decades. Chapter 18. Lessons and Legacy. What lessons can be drawn from the dark story of Jeffrey Epstein's Island? The case illuminates several failures in our systems of justice and accountability that extend far beyond one criminal. First, it demonstrates the power of wealth to corrupt the justice system. Epstein's money bought him the best lawyers who negotiated a deal that would have been unimaginable for a defendant without his resources. His wealth allowed him to own properties in multiple jurisdictions, complicating investigations. His donations to institutions created networks of obligation that made people reluctant to speak against him. Second, it shows the vulnerability of young people, particularly those from troubled backgrounds. Epstein and Maxwell specifically targeted girls who were already victims of abuse, who came from unstable homes, who were desperate for money or opportunities. They exploited these vulnerabilities systematically, using promises of education and advancement to lure victims into situations of abuse. Third, it reveals the complicity that can exist in elite circles. Many people knew or suspected what Epstein was doing, yet he continued to be invited to parties, to receive donations, to cultivate relationships with the powerful. The social and professional consequences for associating with him were minimal until the very end. Fourth, It demonstrates the courage required of survivors who speak out. Virginia Giuffre and others faced intense scrutiny, legal battles, and personal attacks for telling their stories. Their willingness to endure this scrutiny was essential to bringing any measure of accountability. Finally, it raises questions about the adequacy of our systems for holding the powerful accountable. Despite mountains of evidence, Epstein was able to avoid serious consequences for most of his life. Even after his arrest in 2019, his death prevented a full reckoning. Many questions remain unanswered, and many victims never received the justice they deserved. Chapter 19. The Unanswered Questions. More than 5 years after Jeffrey Epstein's death, significant questions remain unanswered. The full extent of his crimes may never be known. The identities of all those who participated may never be revealed. The mechanisms by which he accumulated his wealth remain mysterious, and the circumstances of his death continue to fuel speculation. How did Epstein acquire his fortune? He claimed to manage money for billionaires, but few of his clients have ever been identified. Leslie Wexner, the founder of L Brands and the company behind Victoria's Secret, is the only known major client, and even that relationship remains poorly understood. Wexner granted Epstein power of attorney over his finances in 1991, an extraordinary level of trust that has never been fully explained. He later claimed that Epstein had misappropriated more than $46 million from him, but why he gave such control to Epstein in the first place remains a mystery. Did Epstein have other sources of income beyond financial management? Some investigators have speculated that his wealth came from blackmail, that he used the recordings he allegedly made of powerful people engaging in compromising behavior to extract money and favors. Others have suggested intelligence connections, noting that Epstein had relationships with figures connected to intelligence services and that his activities might have served intelligence purposes. These theories remain unproven, but the mystery of his wealth persists. Who else was involved in his operation? Ghislaine Maxwell was convicted, but she is unlikely to have been his only accomplice. Flight logs, calendars, and victim testimony suggest that numerous other individuals played roles in recruiting victims, maintaining secrecy, and facilitating abuse. Some of these individuals have been named in documents and depositions, but few have faced criminal charges. Sarah Kellen, Nadia Martsinkova, Adriana Ross, and Leslie Groff were all granted immunity as part of the 2008 plea deal. Why have so few been held accountable? What evidence exists that has not been made public? Victims have testified that Epstein recorded sexual encounters, potentially creating a vast archive of compromising material. Virginia Giuffre and others described cameras throughout his properties, capturing what happened in bedrooms and other private spaces. Where are these recordings? Have they been destroyed, hidden, or turned over to authorities? Do they contain evidence that could implicate powerful people who have so far escaped scrutiny? The FBI raided Epstein's Manhattan townhouse and found extensive photographic evidence, including images of nude or partially nude young women. But what else was found? What was on the electronic devices seized from his properties? What was in the safe that contained cash, diamonds, and a foreign passport? These questions have never been fully answered, and the lack of transparency has fueled ongoing suspicion. How did Epstein die? The official conclusion of suicide has been challenged by his brother and by the forensic pathologist hired by his family. The failures of security cameras, the absence of guards, the removal from suicide watch, the transfer of his cellmate, all raise questions that have never been satisfactorily answered. The 2 guards who were supposed to monitor him fell asleep and falsified records. Were they simply negligent, or was there something more sinister at work? The Justice Department's 2025 announcement that it found no evidence of a client list or blackmail operation did little to resolve these questions. The announcement was criticized by those who felt the investigation had been inadequate, and the release of documents has continued to reveal new details that contradict earlier official statements. These questions may never be fully resolved, but the pursuit of answers continues, driven by survivors, journalists, investigators, and a public that refuses to let the matter rest. The full truth about Jeffrey Epstein and his island may be forever beyond reach, but the search for that truth remains an obligation to those who suffered. Chapter 20. Conclusion. The story of Jeffrey Epstein's island is a story about power and its abuses. It is about a man who believed that his wealth made him untouchable, who built a private kingdom where he could indulge his darkest impulses without consequence. It is about the victims who suffered in that kingdom, many of them still children who had their lives forever altered by his crimes. And it is about a system that protected the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. It is also a story about the systems that failed those victims. The prosecutors who gave Epstein a sweetheart deal in 2008, allowing him to serve just 13 months for crimes that should have resulted in decades of imprisonment. The institutions that accepted his money and provided him with respectability, lending their credibility to a known predator. The powerful people who associated with him despite knowing, or choosing not to know, what he was doing. The guards who failed to protect him in custody, whether through negligence or something more deliberate. Little St. James still sits in the Caribbean Sea, 2 miles off the coast of St. Thomas. The buildings that Epstein constructed still stand, awaiting whatever transformation the new owner has planned. The blue waters that once isolated his victims from the world still lap against its shores. The trade winds still blow across its palm trees, indifferent to the horrors that occurred beneath them. But the island's dark history cannot be erased. It stands as a monument to the worst crimes imaginable, committed by a man who believed he was above the law. It serves as a reminder of what can happen when wealth and power are allowed to operate without accountability, when systems designed to protect the vulnerable instead protect the powerful, when justice is for sale to those with enough money to buy it. For the survivors, the story continues. Many are still seeking justice, still dealing with the trauma of their experiences, still fighting to have their voices heard. Virginia Giuffre's death in April 2025 was a devastating loss for the survivor community, but her legacy lives on in the courage she demonstrated and the doors she opened for others to speak out. Her posthumous memoir ensures that her voice will continue to be heard, even after her death. The mansions on Jeffrey Epstein's island held America's secrets. Some of those secrets have been revealed through court documents, testimony, and investigative journalism. Others may remain hidden forever, protected by those who have the most to lose from their disclosure. But the effort to uncover the truth continues, driven by those who refuse to let the powerful escape accountability for their crimes. The names in the flight logs, the photographs in the safes, the recordings that may or may not exist. The powerful people who visited his properties, the systems that protected him for decades. These are the secrets that Epstein took to his grave, and that his victims, their advocates, and investigators continue to pursue. If this story has moved you, I encourage you to subscribe and share it with others who need to know. These stories matter because they show the importance of believing survivors, of pursuing justice even when it seems impossible, and of holding the powerful accountable no matter how long it takes. Tell me in the comments, what do you think should be done with Epstein's island? Should it become a memorial to the victims, a resort as its new owner plans, or something else entirely? And what lessons do you think we should learn from this tragic case? Your thoughts matter, and I read every single comment. Thank you for watching. The dark story of Jeffrey Epstein's island is one that will be studied and discussed for generations to come. It is a cautionary tale about the corruption of power, the vulnerability of the young, and the long, difficult road to justice for those who have been victimized by the wealthy and powerful. Until next time.